You're listening to episode 140 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Teacher and author Donald Altman joins us to speak about Reflect, Awaken to the Wisdom of the Here and Now. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. As contemplative practice is started, it may seem that there is a firm boundary between formal practice and the rest of our daily lives. We may only have a handful of meditations with which we're familiar, and often interest may fade as seeing each unique moment with freshness hasn't quite flourished. But there are ways to bring caring attention and reflection into more of our waking hours and rejuvenate daily practice. Donald Altman is a psychotherapist, award-winning author, and former Buddhist monk. He has written over 15 books that teach how to incorporate mindfulness into daily life, including The Mindfulness Toolbox, Clearing Emotional Clutter, and The Mindfulness Code. Donald has reached out to the community by serving as Vice President of the Center for Mindful Eating and as an adjunct professor in Portland State University's Interpersonal Neurology Certificate Program. He travels internationally, spreading seeds of mindfulness as a health and business consultant, keynote speaker, and mindfulness workshop leader. My guest today is Donald Altman. Don, welcome back. It's good to be speaking with you again. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has, Ted. Well, thanks for inviting me back on today. I'm excited to be here.
So glad to have you here. And I should mention to those of you who are listening to this, who might be scratching your head a little bit, Donald and I have known each other for a number of years, and he's been a guest on another podcast that I do. And we wanted to introduce him to this audience as well because of his strong work with mindfulness. So that's why he's here today. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your background for the listeners of this podcast?
Sure. Well, I was drawn into mindfulness, I guess you could say, through mindlessness, mindless eating, which had been something that had kind of been a thorn in my side. I ate emotionally for a long period of time. I'd been interested in meditation and read some writers like Krishnamurti, and was very interested actually in kind of the some Eastern philosophies. But I had occasion one time, a friend said to me, there's a monk I'd like you to meet. I said, oh, okay. And I met this monk, and it turned out to be a wonderful teaching monk from Burma. His name was U Thilananda. He came to this country in the late 70s with another teacher named Mahasi Sayadaw, who was Jack Kornfield's teacher. And so when I met Thilananda, I was just so touched by the sense of availability and compassion that he had. And I really had no idea, how does somebody become like that? Well, I was going through a particularly difficult time in my life. And I think that sometimes we tend to underestimate the goodness that can come out of those difficult times, and it prompted me to ordain with him in the monastery. I found out he was leading the monastery, and I could ordain with him. And I was just really very curious and intrigued about what would I learn from this man. But it's interesting. One of the first lessons I learned, of course, you go in the monastery, and I didn't really know what to expect. And one of the first things they do is one of the monks comes up to you with a straight razor and he starts shaving off their hair. Now, these are not professional barbers, right? And there's blood. You're getting nicked all over. But one of the first lessons they shared with you, which is very powerful, was they held a lock of hair in front of me and they said, "This is not you." And it was a lesson about non-attachment, right? Non-grasping. Anyway, I went through a beautiful initiation ceremony that lasted probably close to 3 hours. And I was wearing these robes, and they brought myself and two other novice monks into a room in the monastery. And they said, okay, there were 3 futons. They said, find a place where you're going to be sleeping. And we randomly picked futons, and I sat on one. And then suddenly it hit me in that moment. I'm sitting in these robes, my head's shaved now, and I'm really having what I have since called monk spire's remorse. Oh my goodness, what have I done? And in that moment, because my anxiety went up, even though deep down I knew I made a good decision, but my anxiety went up. And I could have used food mindlessly in that moment. It would have been my pattern in my history. And it's interesting. I turned to my left, and on a shelving unit right next to me was one of those giant Cadbury's chocolate bars. And my first thought, Ted, which I'll never forget, is somebody set me up. Of course, they didn't know what futon I was going to sit on. I'd spent a lifetime setting myself up. But my mind went into a reaction, and I found myself at war inwardly. One part of me saying, oh, this chocolate bar would make you feel better right now. Of course, it would distract me and whatnot. On the other hand, I had taken a vow not to eat after 12 noon. And so these were just seemed like mutually exclusive, incontrovertible issues I was dealing with. And I was really in a state of turmoil inside. And then suddenly something really interesting happens. Probably, I don't know how far, maybe it was an hour of just sitting there, when suddenly it was almost like a jolt. I was no longer engaged in this war of thoughts, but I was sitting outside of it, just watching it. And it was a moment of just, for me, a moment of epiphany and realization that I wasn't those thoughts, and that I didn't have to hold on to or identify with them. I could honor the part of me that was needy, that was wanting some kind of comfort in that moment, and I could follow my vows. So these were not mutually exclusive, but it was kind of like as they were all part of one container now, and I could hold all of that. And that was a really important experience for me that moved me forward.
Well, I think a very important experience to recognize that these are not mutually exclusive, that you can observe and experience craving, some form of thirst, of leaning into, and also make a choice about it and have it be part of your experience of what's happening right now.
Yeah. And so often we're pulled into these states of duality or opposition. And that really caused a lot of suffering in life, really, when you think about it. And when you can come back to this moment. And I really like the original, and Uthilananda was a wonderful teacher of mindfulness. He said, one time I had an interview with him, which I would do frequently. And one time he said to me, mindfulness is free. We're born with it. And at the same time, I think, well, and also you have to actively energize yourself and exercise the ability to develop that skill. So even though it's free, we have the innate capacity for it. We need to work for it. And that means taking some kind of action.
So how long were you a monk, and then what came next for you?
Well, I wasn't in there for that long period of time. I was in the monastery for about 4 months. And I went in knowing it would be for a period of time, but I think I was kind of ripe like an apple. I was ready to fall off a tree. And I continued to work with the monks after I went, but I had always kind of seen my work as being out in the world. And What was so interesting for me was there was also a ceremony for leaving the monastery, handing back the robes and still taking some vows as you left the monastery. So I really like to think that I carry the monastery in my heart all these many years later and still continue to do the work, the practices, which I think have been just meaningful in my life and have helped me meet so many people. I went back to school after the monastery. I started doing workshops on mindful eating. In fact, later became one of the vice president of the Center for Mindful Eating. And yet, what happened was that I would have people come to me in my workshops who were suffering from really physically difficult issues like anorexia, bulimia, and I didn't know how to deal with that. So actually went back to school, got a psychotherapy degree, and started practicing as a licensed clinician. And I was still bringing in the mindfulness ideas and still trying to help people recover their sense of wholeness. And I couldn't have in any way anticipated that my life would have turned in such a direction from going into the monastery, even for that short period of time. But it was very profound for me, and it changed me, I think, from the inside out in a lot of ways. I feel very blessed to be able to help teach people mindfulness practices. And what I like to do is to come back kind of to the original meaning of mindfulness, the word sati, which is S-A-T-I, the Sanskrit word for mindfulness, which originally meant self-recollection and self-remembrance. And so I see it as a way of regaining our wholeness, the lost parts of ourselves, the fragmented parts of ourselves that we lose to distraction, that we lose to being drawn by technology and all the different things that may keep us from really fully inhabiting this present moment.
So let's talk a bit about your new book. And for those of you who are listening to this episode, please do make a point of coming to the episode page because I will be putting up links for several of Donald's books. But the one we're talking about today is new, called Reflect, Awaken to the Wisdom of the Here and Now. And I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about how is this book different than the ones you've published before?
This is quite a departure in a way. I mean, a lot of my books are, I think you would consider self-help books. The Mindfulness Code really was very steeped in stories and neuroscience and practices. I wrote a book called Clearing Emotional Clutter, which continued along the same vein with a lot of new information. But what makes this book different is it's really is a meditative book. It's a book, even though it says reflect, I think of reflect as, the original word of reflect, if you go back to the Latin, means to bend back. It's like bending back our lost awareness, our fractured parts of ourselves, bringing awareness back to us. And I see reflection, it's really something I developed to help people who find it difficult to sit for periods of time nowadays. And I think nowadays, just sitting, going to a monastery, going to a retreat, going even MBSR training is difficult for a lot of people to find the time to do that. So I started to think more about how people are using their time nowadays. And also because I've learned about how the brain wires up. So in a lot of my books, I talk about brain science, and there's a part of the brain right behind the eyebrow ridge and the kind of the underside part of the brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. I call it the reflect module of the brain because it's where we look inward. It's really the most human part of the brain. It's the social part of the brain. It's where we make connections with others face to face. It's how we experience empathy, can feel compassion. And so this is also the part of the brain where we look inward and can think about our actions and can sit and look at our thoughts, our mind, our emotions. And I think there's a way to do that throughout the day where you can even do it for a few minutes a day. And it has, I think, if you do it in a targeted way, can have as much of an impact as sitting for a long time in meditation. And eventually you'll get to the same place. You know what they say, there's so many different paths up the mountaintop, right? So this is just another path for people who might be so inclined. So this book, unlike my other books, which had a lot of narrative, this has a short reading. on one page, and the readings are meant to be gently provocative, even, waking you up a little bit and to break through old patterns or old stuck ways of being. And then after reading that, I have on the facing page 3 questions. And those reflective questions take you more deeply and allow you to just sit. And I think that what I've been doing, I've been using the book myself and been finding it very fascinating how I will start reflecting throughout my day. So I'll just take one of those readings a day and read it in the morning and just sit with that. And then throughout the day, I'll think about those reflections, just maybe pausing. So I'm traveling through an airport. This happened to me recently. And I had the book with me. I was doing a workshop in Cleveland and the plane got canceled. So I had to get a new flight to Cincinnati. And there were only 3 seats left on this plane to Cincinnati. And the 2 people who were in front of me, they were together. They had gotten that flight, and they heard that I was also getting on that plane. And they said, "Oh, we're getting a rental car to Cincinnati. Would you like to come with us?" Now, this would have been a 4.5-hour ride, getting it around 12:30 in the morning into Cleveland. Also, they lost our bags. And so I said, okay. And I thought it was really wonderful. And then I started afterwards, well, I'm thinking, oh, these are people who don't even know, and who knows what this is going to be like. And so I opened up the book and I opened it to, and I really believe there's a synchronicity to things. And that one of the way to use this book is, yeah, sure, you can go through it sequentially. And in the beginning of the book, I have a section on simplicity and peace, which is more about getting to know the mind, getting to know your emotions. I think that's a nice place to start. But after that, it gets to be like, just open it up to wherever you happen to go to. And I opened it up to, it had something to do about that we're never alone and that we need to trust in others and realize that we're all interdependent, interconnected. And that gave me a sense of, it helped me relax actually in the moment. It's like, yeah, this is an affirmation that it's okay I get to meet these strangers. I get to be curious. I get to be open here. And in fact, it was a wonderful trip. And they were great guys that I got to meet. So I think that sometimes just pausing, because we can so easily get into a kind of a mindless trance state during the day. You get caught up in what you're doing, you get lost in thoughts, you're focused on what you need to do in the future. And it's like you're not here anymore. And so the reflection practice, just recalling it, remembering it for a moment, just brings you back. And it lets you see that everybody around you, everybody's, got somewhere in their head, they're trying to do something just like you are. And so it helps you, I think, ultimately build compassion and connection. And that for me is the real core of this practice, of any mindfulness practice. And I think sometimes it gets lost in how it's taught. But the real purpose of it is to notice suffering, to become aware of suffering, and then to reduce it in some way through expanding our compassion. When you notice suffering in another, you realize, even if their suffering is spilling over onto you, that in some sense you could view them in a more compassionate, kind way. Everybody's dealing with difficulties in their lives.
Yeah.
And so
In fact, as you've been speaking, I flipped to the book and found exactly what you're describing. And I'm wondering if you'd mind, I found a different passage. I just want to give the listeners just a brief sample. And for those of you at home who have your own copy, I'm on page 74. I'm just going to read you a line or two from the left side, the reflection, and then just one or two of the questions that are on the right side. So the title for this reflection is "Don't Wait Another Moment to Send the Warm Smile of Love Inward." Since no one gets the perfect parent, why not play the role of being your own best parent and friend? Acknowledge that you're doing your best. And it goes on a little bit more, and then some questions are posed, offered on the right. The first one is, how can you befriend yourself in the next 24 hours? And I really like that because it puts a manageable context around it just for the next day. How might you do this? And then another question, how can you accept that you're doing your best? And that really highlights how challenging it can sometimes be to offer kindness. We might do it all the time for others, and it's a little more difficult. I found quite common in our society to do so ourselves.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
wanted to give that exposure. Uh,
Oh, thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for putting that in. And maybe we can
Well,
talk.
I love you just happened to turn to that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And it is really a beautiful way to engage with several layers of meaning that might not be initially obvious upon a first read. That you've really crafted the wording of this very carefully. And maybe we can talk in a little bit about how this can be useful in practice. But I want to talk about something else first. And this has to do more with you and your own practice, because you mentioned using this yourself. As you were putting this together, were there some reflections that caught your own imagination that were more sticky than others and have stayed with you a little bit longer?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There was some about the body that I like, that getting to the body. I'm just leafing through. I want to get to one here that there's some of these, like this one here. It is only by disarming the ego that war truly ceases. Some believe that fighting with others is the path to peace. Before you raise the sword against another, see the truth of your own righteous love of war. Without an ego, who is around to look for a fight? Only a mind of peace creates more peace. Reflect on this. So that's one that, I mean, I keep trying to diffuse and disarm my own ego, my own identity. And I think that the wonderful thing is that when we can start to notice when we get ignited, I think of two houses. One house is filled with straw, another house is all completely cleaned out with concrete floors, nothing to catch on fire. So if I threw a match in both of these houses, that one with the straw would go up immediately. And so you can think of that straw as what triggers us in our own mind, what inflames us. Where are those areas that we may be attached to in an ego sense of identity or defending ourselves? And how can we? I think it's important for us to start to look at that and to learn that there can be another way. And it takes time, because we're also talking about rewiring the brain, which is a process that occurs over time. And they actually have taken the Dalai Lama's monks, a guy named Richard Davidson. Maybe you've heard of this, Ted.
In Wisconsin, yep.
Yeah, in Wisconsin. And so these are people with maybe 10,000 hours of compassion meditation training, much like Uthadananda, I think the monk that I met, found out that loving kindness was his favorite meditation, the favorite thing he loved to teach. And so I think that's how he had developed that sense of compassion. But they found that they have substantially different brains than most humans, and it's considered to be maybe the sign of a highly functioning brain. They had even a very minimal startle response to loud noises. They were really in a state of great peace. And so it would be difficult to ignite one of those persons.
Mhm.
And they've done that work. But I think it's just wonderful to think that that may be an illustration, a demonstration of the potential within us and the immense capacity as humans that we have. Like you said, we're so easily able to get down on ourselves or to be harsh about ourselves and not accept ourselves. We realize that these kinds of things require a lot of practice.
Mhm.
And when you're engaged in it, it's especially important, I think, to invite inner hospitality and kindness to yourself, because everybody takes a little different path here. There's no maybe straight road to getting there.
Yeah, and that highlights a very important aspect of this is that we're all unique. We all start from perhaps very different places in how
Oh,
we receive
absolutely.
this. And that's constantly changing. And so, again, what a great clarion call for gentleness as we engage with practice and maybe stumble and maybe get up again too.
And to what again?
And maybe get up again too
Oh,
once we
yeah, absolutely. And I know you do a lot of work with resilience. And I think the other interesting thing I think about doing this practice is, in psychology, there's something called response flexibility. It's the ability to think adaptively and creatively about things. And I think what happens is when you start doing this, you start finding that you're able to get out of the little boxes that maybe you've been stuck in, and you get insights about things and think. And I think that it's a yeah, maybe for a more practical sense, it gives you some greater capability for creative problem solving. I don't know if you've experienced that.
Yeah, certainly in that the practice tends to, and again, with practice, tends to clear some of the clutter. And the mind is perhaps a little more in a place of indistractability, as Lee Brasington might put it. And that helps open up the road to choices. What really are some options that are here now, as opposed to a state of excitation, maybe being in a fight, flight, or freeze where options are very limited and there's more constriction and imagination can't
Absolutely.
go as much. John, I'm wondering if you might segue a little bit with this idea of practicality and what you might recommend to readers about how reflections could be useful in their own practice. How would you recommend someone approach this book?
I would say that, there are a lot of different sections in the book, and I would say you might even pick out sections that resonate with you. So there's a section on wisdom, a section on transformation, a section on bliss. And so looking at bliss, even, I think that sometimes we think of a lot of things more absolute terms. Oh, bliss, a bliss state must be this extraordinary, wonderful state
Magical thing.
being floating on air. And I like the way I describe bliss in the different readings in the book is that it's something, there's an ordinary bliss that we experience when we're right here, right now. This sense of tranquility, a sense of contentment, a sense of peace for the way things are without having necessarily resist them or reject them. And think about how much energy you put into resisting or rejecting even the little things in your life. And I had an experience of this one time. I was seeing a lot of clients as a psychotherapist one particular day, and I wasn't feeling as centered and focused as I wanted to be. And so I had a cancellation. I thought, oh, this is a perfect time to walk down about 3 blocks from my office to the river, and I'll do a nice centering walking meditation. And so I went down there and started to walk. It was a lot cooler than I thought. It was very brisk wind blowing, and my mind, kind of a reactive thought, what came up. Oh, this isn't very pleasant. It's really cold. You didn't bring your jacket. But I kept walking, and there were some kids who were playing in a field nearby, a little park nearby, and there were some swing sets and a little playground. They were just having the greatest time. They were shouting and screaming as kids do, right? And I heard this, and my mind jumped in, and I call these almost mind whispers, very subtle thoughts that your mind will sometimes reactively say to you. And so my mind said, "Oh, those kids, they're so loud, and noisy. They're ruining my perfect walking meditation." Right? And then another thought came by very quickly. It was a mind whisper, and it said, "Go back to the office. It's warmer there, quieter. You'll have a better meditation." So, in other words, that place wasn't good enough, right? I had to reject it for somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere warmer. And so, what I did was I just started to laugh when I caught that mind whisper that sometimes these can act almost like little commands, and we act like robots, and so we follow those commands. But I started to laugh, and I realized, wait, I'm just going to allow it all in instead of trying to resist it. So I let in the sounds of the kids, I let in the cool air, and I just had a very centering, wonderful walk, being present with the conditions of my life in that moment.
Mhm.
Sometimes it can even get to the point where in subtle ways, you're having dinner with a friend and you look over, you ordered a dish and you look over what they ordered and you think to yourself, oh, I should have had that. I should have ordered that meal. And that's a subtle rejection of our own meal, which is a kind of metaphor, right? What meals in life do we not fully accept?
Yeah. What's interesting, the just this past week in teaching one of my classes, it brought the example of how our response to something can really, really affect how we receive it and what it's like, what the feeling tone is. And I used as the example in the morning when I'm sitting, my cat sometimes likes to join me. And his meow, his sound, when I'm attached, as you were just mentioning with your walk and the kids making noise, is one of resistance. is one of pushing against. And for those of you who are listening, Donald's holding up his cat now, so he's familiar with this experience that I'm sharing.
Oh, yeah, right to me here.
And noticing that,
Yeah,
and then receiving that same sound and just receiving it as part of the soundscape of what's here right now.
yeah,
And how that changes the feeling tone of that moment, how that changes me by that simple choice. And it is a choice. And it's when I have every moment, whatever it was before, doesn't matter. I can choose right now. There's no difference whatsoever in the sound the cat's making. It's not suffering or irritation. It's not part of the sound. It's part of us and how we're receiving it. And we can
how
have
you
some flexibility on that.
I've had to laugh sometimes when I'm doing a workshop, and you encounter all kinds of things. And we were doing the morning meditation, and a jackhammer starts going off just outside the window of the workshop. And there was one lady in there who really, she grabbed onto that. And right after the meditation, when I ask people for questions and we kind of process what's happened and their experiences, she was very irate that how dare they do this outside her window. And another lady, it was interesting, another lady piped up and said, "Oh, I found it so interesting. I heard the sound and I let it go." And it just shows you how different perspectives that we have and how we can kind of grow in our awareness of accepting even things that, and recognizing how we grab on
Exactly.
negatively or positively.
So, Donald, I'm wondering, is there anything else that you want to share with the listeners?
I would like to share this one. Here's one about that I've found to be very important, and I like to talk a lot about gratitude. And you could think of gratitude as a selective attention practice. Where are you placing your awareness? I mean, you can notice what's missing in your life, or comparing yourself to others, or how you feel you're deficient in some way. Or you can also place your awareness on the good, the decent, the beautiful things in life and all the capacities that we're all capable of. And I call this is called There's a Silver Lining in Everything. Yes, there are things you hate that disrupt your life, and great, but how solid and permanent are these? With each phenomena you witness, there's also a silver lining that materializes with the passage of time. Soften and look into your past, and you will find the grace of silver linings. It is the silver linings that make life rich and meaningful. Reflect on this. And then I have some questions to help people think about opening up to making space for that silver lining. And I think it's a beautiful thing when I've heard people share their stories. And I think gratitude is a wonderful way of appreciating the goodness that exists in life. And again, life gives us a full menu of things, but we don't have to, necessarily always focus on the negative.
It does. And for those who are following at home, that's on page 146. And if you want to see what my favorite of the questions, it's the third one, but you'll have to get the book to find out what that is. Our guest today is our friend Donald Altman. You can find out more about his work. Come to the episode page for this episode. We'll have links to this book, the one we're talking about today, Reflect, as well as several others, and some links to other articles and work that Donald does. Thank you so much for being here. Good to see you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Ted. Thank you to your audience for listening.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.